Great. Well, welcome everyone to the December 2023 Bible and Beyond Textual Study and Discussion. I'm your host, Shirley Paulson, and our guest this evening is Dr. Robert Miller, who is returning to the Bible and Beyond discussions for another great conversation. This is our second discussion in our current series on the Jewishness of Jesus. And our topic tonight is how Jesus, a Jew, got tangled up in the atonement. Christians may realize that Jesus really was a Jew. After all, he was born of a Jewish mother, which automatically designates him as Jewish. But the Christian teachings that focus on such topics as atonement makes us feel that Jesus was somehow born a Christian and born a Jew and then created the Christian religion the next day or whatever. Anyway, so we'll take a closer look at these issues and discuss the origins and meaning of atonement in the context of Jesus's Jewish heritage. So let me make sure you know a little bit about Bob. He is the Rosenberger Chair of Christian and Religious Studies at Juniata College in Pennsylvania. I got to know Bob from my participation in the Westar Institute, and you can't get very far into Westar without realizing what a remarkable contribution Bob has made. For a long time, he's been the editor of Westar's magazine, The Fourth R. If you don't know what that is, it's a take on the three R's and how the fourth R, religion, is literacy about religion. So Bob was also involved in Westar's Jesus Seminar and wrote a book explaining it. Last month in our Bible and Beyond discussion, Gordon Raynell referred to another important book, The Complete Gospels, and Bob is the editor for that book as well. There's a lot more, but I think you'll appreciate the depth of Bob's knowledge and experience as we get into our program. And actually, just another moment before we do, I want to remind you that the very best way you can support our Bible and Beyond discussions and everything else we do at Early Christian Texts website is to support us through Patreon. That's a monthly pledge of any amount that's right for you. It's quite simple. You go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond, and there it's easy to sign up. You'll see that we offer additional incentives that go with your membership for signing up at different levels. Or else direct payments through our PayPal or checks are also appreciated too. So anyway, Bob, welcome. We're so glad to have you with us tonight.
It's always a pleasure, Shirley. Thanks.
It's going to be fun. So we are, as I said, we're in the midst of our Bible and Beyond series on the subject of the Jewishness of Jesus. And I'm really glad that you've come to address some of the more nuanced ideas about Jesus and his connection to the Jewish world that he was born into and lived. One of the biggest things that Christians are often taught about Jesus is that he died for our sins. So I want to ask you, does this idea come from his Jewish origin in any way or not? Let's just go there first.
It has some roots there, but Jesus, his own teaching focuses on a very distinctive and very direct approach to how sins are forgiven that really doesn't address atonement at all.
Oh,
I can give some examples of that if you'd like.
Yeah, maybe give us one so we can go from there.
Okay, it is often in the place in the New Testament where people who ponder atonement and how it works is the letter to the Hebrews. Very sophisticated, somewhat complex piece of writing with basically philosophical reasoning about how it is that Jesus' bloody death made things right between God and humanity. And oftentimes people who defend that belief in blood atonement quote this one verse in Hebrews that says, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sin.
Okay, yeah.
As if to make it seem that that's the only way it could have happened. And yet there are gospel stories of Jesus forgiving people's sins without any blood, his own being shed at all. He simply does so because at the moment, that seems to be what divine mercy calls for.
Okay.
Some of his stories are also have been interesting. The parable, very famous parable of the two sons, one son goes off and, wastes his inheritance. An elder son stays back and acts all responsible. And when he comes back, the father forgives him, which no self-respecting father would ever do. And the older brother is right to complain, hey, wait a minute, I've stayed here all these years and labored for you. And this guy comes back after wasting all your assets and you just forgive him. I mean, the younger son made no atonement.
Yeah.
He made this very phony confession, and the father doesn't demand it. He simply forgives him.
Wow. Okay, so it seems like atonement, the way we're used to hearing about it anyway, is always linked to the death of Jesus. Then why then are we going to his death?
That's linked in the New Testament. I mean, Paul certainly works with that theory. Like I said, the letter to the Hebrews does. And a few things that Jesus is reported to have said, but almost certainly did not say. For instance, when he says, I have come I basically come to die, right? And that I've come to die as a ransom for many. And then it's, again, hooked into that night before he dies, when he offers this body and blood under the symbols of bread and wine, and says, this is to be for my death. And it's always been interpreted as an atonement ceremony. Your audience is probably well aware, I'm sure, of the difference between the historical Jesus as he was known to his contemporaries, and the gospel Jesus, in which, his words and deeds have been tailored to fit the needs of later Christian readers.
Well, Bob, wait a second here. I wouldn't jump to that conclusion quite so fast.
Okay.
So I think we understand a historical Jesus as a human being, but so what's the difference then between the historical Jesus and the Gospels? Let's go over that a little bit.
All right, Gospels are written between 40 to 70 years after his death, and they combine memories of what he said and did with interpretations and major additions to that in order to tailor his story and his teachings to a later audience who already believes in him. And so scholars make a very strict distinction between what we can actually certify as going back to Jesus himself versus what has been embellished or interpreted or even as sometimes just fictionalized by gospel writers. And the point I want to make is that the places in the Gospels where Jesus connects his bloody death to some kind of atonement ritual are almost certainly not from Jesus himself.
So that's not the historical Jesus then.
Right. And I mean, of course, that has to do with this whole idea that Jesus' death was a sacrifice, and human sacrifice was utterly abhorrent to Jews. And it just was simply impossible that could have occurred as a notion that people would have understood or accepted, or that Jesus himself would have had. Jesus. Go ahead.
No, well, so I'm just saying then. So then you're saying that this idea of this atonement came later than the historical time where Jesus was. Right.
Okay. And then the explanations of that, of how this blood of Jesus and his death actually works to forgive sin, is developed by Christian thinkers all the way through the Middle Ages up into the time of Martin Luther, as they attempt to give some rationale to explain how this strange theory might actually work.
Okay. Well, then how did Christian thinkers explain then how Jesus' death would atone for sins when you've told us that it wasn't really going that way with the Jewish world at the time? How did that happen then?
Well, I mean, once his death got connected to the idea of atonement, I mean, they had to explain, why did Jesus, whom they believed to be the Messiah, die such a horrific death and rejected by nearly all of his own people? And the interpretation they gave to that is that, well, his death was really God's plan, that God sent Jesus to die, that his mission was to actually go through that horrifying death in order to accomplish what apparently couldn't have been accomplished in any other way. I want to think about what a strange thought that actually is.
Okay.
First of all, because calling it a sacrifice isn't a description, it's an interpretation. And the only sacrifice people knew at the time was animal sacrifice. And so human sacrifice didn't even fit that. And so it's a very sticky thing to try to work with. But these theories that come up later, I don't want to go into them in detail unless you want to hear about them. But there's three major kinds. I'll just mention them very briefly. One was called the ransom theory, which comes from that verse in Mark's gospel where Jesus said he came to die as a ransom. And in the ancient world, ransom was a very common thing. That's how you bought slaves away from their slavery.
Wow.
And so the idea was that God pays our ransom with the death of Jesus. And so the question, well, ransom to whom? I mean, how does it, and the theory was that, well, but when humans sinned, they gave themselves over to the devil, became his slaves, and therefore God had to pay a ransom to atone for that. And the problems with that are, I think, pretty clear, and were pointed out by later theologians. The second one, which is very common still, is that it's called the satisfaction theory of atonement. It comes up in the Middle Ages with the great theologian Anselm. And his belief is that humans, when they sin, they had offended God's honor. And that God cannot just forgive. There has to be some satisfaction required to repair that disrespect, that dishonor. Mm-hmm. And that Jesus makes that satisfaction with his death. And so it's all about these medieval notions of the Lord's honor and how that has to be redeemed. And that's really interesting to go into. And I will, if you want to pursue it.
Yeah, just for a little bit. Let's go there a little bit, because it was that satisfaction idea going on with the Jews back in Jesus' time? Or
No. It's long gone. It's a product of medieval society, mm-hmm. in which you have a political system in which the central government's very small and weak, and basically people live under what we would today call warlords, mm-hmm. and orders maintained by warlords who have armies that they pay to mm-hmm. keep order, and that if any of their subjects offends their honor, mm-hmm. they have to make an example out of that.
Okay.
That the Lord might forgive you what you've done, but then you still had to suffer some kind of public display in which you satisfy the Lord's honor, so that he could show other people that you just can't do this and get away with it, that I'm a strong leader. Mm-hmm. And so God is imagined as the Lord of Lords. And so that's in medieval society, that was a very understandable way of looking at things.
Okay. So and then you can go on then with the third one that you were talking about.
I mean, the third one comes with Martin Luther, who's moved past the Middle Ages into a Renaissance period where ideas of law are beginning to change. Mm-hmm. It's believed that even kings are subject to law, mm-hmm. and that human sin disrupts the moral order, the lawful order, and that sinners are in a state of guilt and therefore must be punished, and that the moral order has to be restored, and God is not above that. God must do something to restore that moral order. And then there's this complicated theory by which it's explained that Jesus takes the punishment for human sin, and that his death then restores the moral order. Again, you can see all kinds of issues that pop up with that, like how does a violent death fix anything that's wrong, etc. Yeah. So all of these are attempts in their own time and place to make sense of this, and all of them really, once you step outside of them, you just wonder, like, they all assume that God cannot or will not forgive without some kind of punishment.
Oh my gosh. So you think that none of this would have come about if Jesus had not been crucified? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, it's very hard to see any of this taking off if he had died of old age or died of the flu or something like that, because then there would be no real need to explain such horrific and bloody event of his death. I mean, for Jesus himself, atonement was really not part of the whole forgiveness. He just said in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive those indebted to us.
Oh.
And as we forgive means, I think, forgive us our debts to the extent that we forgive others. And in the Aramaic language, debt and sin are the same words. So there's this very nice double play there. Mm-hmm. So for Jesus, you say, well, show God how much you want to be forgiving by how much you forgive others.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the Jewish mode, and it's carried even in today into the solemn days of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in which Jews, before they ask God for forgiveness, have to make things right with all the people that they have offended in the past year. And so there's no blood, there's no hideous suffering is needed for that. There's simply, if you want forgiveness, you have to be forgiving. I don't think that's like a price. It's not a price you pay to be forgiven. I think there's a very deep psychological insight here. It's that unless you forgive other people, you really don't have what it takes to embrace being forgiven yourself. Mm. You'll always think there's some hitch somewhere or something. You see what I mean here? It's that almost by learning to forgive people, we understand our own need for forgiveness, because sometimes accepting forgiveness can be very difficult, can be humiliating, can offend our pride, etc. And so the ability to accept forgiveness, I think, and I don't want to make Jesus into a modern psychologist, but what he said was, I think, a profound truth here is that the way we forgive other people is the way God will forgive us. And there's no need for human sacrifice in any of that.
So the idea of atonement was going on with the Jews during Jesus' lifetime. Is that right? Just the idea?
Yeah, sure. There were certain sins that could be atoned for through sacrifice, through offering an animal in an appropriate ritual way. There are some sins which just could be wiped away just by, not sins, but I say infractions, which could be restored. You could be restored to simply by observing certain rituals. So this was a well-established. It's in Torah. It had been interpreted for centuries, and the sacrificial operation in the cult in the temple in Jerusalem was considered to be the highest point of offering atonement. And we could say more about that, but it's connected to this idea of animal sacrifice, something quite foreign to our culture, but absolutely universal in the ancient world. Every ancient culture had animal sacrifice and understood it without having explained to them why that is just something that I just assumed. And Jews were no different, but they had their own idiom in which that happened.
Yeah. So then Jesus would have, I think I'm hearing you say that it would have been a surprise to Jesus then to think of his own death as connected in any way to this understanding of atonement that was going on with animal sacrifice.
Right, because he wasn't an animal and he wasn't properly sacrificed in a temple. He was tortured to death by the Romans, who had no interest in performing a Jewish ritual. Their intentions in crucifying him were to make an example out of what happens to people who intrude on Roman power.
Mm-hmm. So would Jesus have thought that it was his mission to die then in any way? I did that?
No. It's hard to read his mind, of course, because we have so little to go on. But I would liken it to Martin Luther King's insight. Okay. That he knew he was probably going to get killed.
Okay.
If he kept on doing what he did, and he kept on doing it, and he was murdered. And I believe that Jesus was aware. He had seen crucified humans. That was something the Romans made sure happened. Yeah. And he knew this might happen to me, right? And in the wrong circumstances, if I'm misunderstood or if I'm understood, that this could happen. And he continued with the willingness, I'm guessing, the willingness in his own mind that it was worth that risk to pursue what he believed to be God's mission. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, he didn't come to die, but he accepted that risk, as any martyr does, as a possible price to pay for his faithfulness to what he believed was his God-given mission.
So then we're not seeing it then as doing it to accomplish anything, but he's doing it as a result of his commitment to his own mission.
Right, right. And this is all tied up in this ambiguity of our word why. If you say, why did something happen? Like, why did I go to that party? Well, I was invited. That's the cause of me going, right?
Yeah.
Why did I go? Well, I wanted to have fun. That was my purpose in attending.
Okay.
Or why did I go? Hey, I met my wife there. Who knew? Well, I didn't go in order to meet my wife. I didn't even know she existed, right? But I did meet her at a party, and that was a result. And I think we confuse this, that causes and results and purposes are very different things, but they're all wrapped up in the ambiguity of our English word why. Yeah. Why did Jesus die? And I was taught as a kid, right? Jesus came to earth to die for our sins. That was who he was. That was what he did. And if you're familiar with the Apostles' Creed, Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, and died. I mean, there's nothing, his life is gone. He's born and then he's dead. Born and then on a cross. There's nothing in the creed about anything he said or taught or did. So it's the idea of his coming to earth to perform this mission of being tortured to death has so crowded out the later Christian theology that there's almost no room for anything else.
So then could you help us then, jumping back to the gospel writers?
Sure.
What did they think of themselves as changing the story, or do you think that it was part of their just understanding of Jesus in a new way that made sense? I mean, I'm just trying to understand, because now it sounds like you're saying this is a different story from what happened, and I'm trying to understand why they would have done that.
The reasons are unknown to us. All we can do is look at their stories.
Yeah,
and we do have clear examples where a later gospel writer will copy from an earlier one and make a change in the story. Sometimes simply to fix the grammar, but sometimes to change the whole meaning of it. And that's a conscious choice they're making. So at that point, we can ask, well, why would they make these kinds of choices? And with the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, who are copying from Mark, we can make some pretty precise guesses at that. In other cases, we don't really know how much these writers actually knew about the historical Jesus. I mean, they were writing 2, 3, 4 generations later, based upon reports they had. And his story of his life had many, many gaps in it. The biggest one being, of course, the birth story. There was nothing there to start with. And so sometimes they just simply had to write him something, write him an appropriate, how would someone like this respond in a situation like this if he were here today? Because his Gospels were never seen by anybody as reporting what happened in the past. They were always seen as, what is Jesus saying to us now, today, in our situation? Because he's not dead. He's not a man from the past. He is a power. He's the Son of God in heaven. And so these Gospels were always seen as being addressed to contemporary people about their questions. And these gospel writers, and there were many of them, as Shirley, I hope, has made everyone aware, there was far more than the 4 that are in the Gospels. And they, shall we say, mold, you could probably say less flatteringly that they twisted and manipulated, but all artists do that. They always manipulate the material that they have to serve the purpose that they believe is appropriate to them. So it's one of the most fascinating and frustrating adventures, is to try to figure out the historical Jesus as he was before he became the hero of the Gospels.
That's so helpful, Bob, to be able to think about the fact that they weren't writing history. I mean, I know that, but they were writing for the immediate situation that they were living in.
Right.
I think that's a very helpful way to understand the motive. Like, they're not intentionally just trying to distort things to write fantasy. They're writing something that's very real to their own situation at the time, and the way they understood the way Jesus was useful to them at the time. Instead of,
sure.
I like that idea that he wasn't dead to them, he was alive to them, and that's what they were writing.
Right. Right.
Really.
And Shirley, as you know, and as you've told people, there are early Christian texts in which the risen Jesus himself starts to speak to people, right? Long after he's been on earth and in heaven, and he's the one who directs or empowers people to speak in his name. It's always this attempt to contemporize the message.
Yeah, very interesting. So, and then going back, this is helpful for us to distinguish between as you put it, the historical Jesus and the gospel written Jesus. That's a helpful concept. So at the time of Jesus, was there a belief in Judaism that the death of an innocent person would have any particular meaning? Or is that something they had to just figure out later?
Yes, there was. And it had to do with the death of martyrs. Okay. And it goes back to the story of the Maccabee martyrs, if you might know about those. These were Jews who had chosen to risk persecution, even death, rather than give up their Jewish religion under pressure from a Assyrian king. Mm-hmm. And the ones who maintained their faithfulness all the way to death mm-hmm. were seen as they died for us.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean that they died and our sins are forgiven. It meant that they died and left us examples of how we too need, right, to defend our way with God. Oh. And that God accepted these deaths as not just tragedies, but that the heroism and the spiritual fortitude and quality showed by these heroes is held up as an example. And these stories of the Maccabees, I'm not sure I want you to read them because they are horrifying in their detail of the hideous tortures inflicted on these martyrs. But you can see here the Jewish mind trying to make some kind of sense out of why is it that people who die for God's law mm-hmm. end up being punished, especially when the promise for righteousness was a long and happy life. So how could that be? And they believed in that God must have had some way of making this right. And this is when the beliefs in afterlife begin to percolate into the Jewish faith, because God is then rewarding these heroes by having them raised from the dead. This was a new idea at the time, and it flowed into Judaism through the stories of the martyrs. And so the death of Jesus, the very first interpretation of that was that he too died a martyr. He too died in faithfulness to his mission. If I can recommend a book on this, and I would like to do that, a remarkable book by a colleague of mine, Stephen Patterson. It's called Beyond the Passion. It's written for a general audience, and it's simply brilliant. And I'm just envious because it's the book I wanted to write, but he wrote it better, and he wrote it more brilliantly, and he wrote it before I even tried. So I have no need to do anything because it's all in that book. So Stephen Patterson, Beyond the Passion. You will not be disappointed with,
very helpful.
with that book.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. Well, so we're moving into our first half hour here. We've finished this when I have a chance to talk to you and ask you all the questions, and now we're going to open up the floor to let everybody else have a chance to interview you and ask questions. Okay. So again, just to make sure everybody knows what we're doing, it's easiest if you will raise your hand electronically, which means that you go to the reactions down at the bottom of your Zoom page, click on reactions, and you'll see the part where it says raise hand. When you do that, then it's easier for me to see you have your hand raised. If you can't do that, don't worry, just put your hand up and we'll look around the screens and see if we find you. But that's my goal. So first hand up already, we have DJA. So go ahead with what you have to say.
Okay, that's me.
Yeah.
I'm listening. I've heard several people give a similar argument for what you're saying, but I have my own concept. I tendency to go back to the Gospels and feel like what the Gospels teach is what I recognize from the message from Jesus or about Jesus, and that he rose from the dead and he was with his disciples and then he ascended. I accept that. I accept that as being the truth of the story. And part of the thing is that he did this because he wanted people to realize that there was life after death. And the only way he really could prove it is by doing in a public situation. So people knew that his body had actually died. And when he came back, he was risen from the dead. And basically that if there's life after death and you want to enter into the kingdom of heaven, so to speak, you had to let go of your ways that didn't accord with let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. In other words, you had to try to emphasize those qualities in your thought, which means that you had to forgive. You had to be forgiving and you had to be loving, etc. I mean, that's how I comprehend the story. And
you would hear Bob? Yeah. So we hear Bob. Yeah. What do you think about that, Bob?
What is there a question? I didn't hear one.
It's not really a question, just do you have any comments on her comment?
She's testified to her faith, so I'm pleased that she did that.
Yeah. Very nice and very helpful. Thank you. Okay, and Honor? You can unmute yourself.
Did I do it? Am I unmuted?
You're on. Yes, thank you.
Okay, good.
You're on. Yeah.
I have a question, but first I want to comment that I really appreciate much that you said about the issue of Jesus' death, because I have often thought if we could sit down at the kitchen table with him and ask him what he thinks, he might say, my gosh, you guys, I spent 3 years teaching you all these wonderful ideas, and the only thing you're focusing on is these guys that killed me.
Yeah.
You missed the point. So, but my question is, you said, you referred to a statement of Jesus saying he had come to give his life as a ransom for many.
Right.
I can see that as not necessarily meaning getting killed. I mean, if somebody I love is kidnapped and they ask for ransom, they aren't expecting me to go kill myself. They're expecting me to give them money or some other thing. Was that statement one of the embroidered ones, or is it reasonable to think that he actually said that?
No, I don't have any reason to think he said it. It is about him being killed because it follows directly on his predictions that he will be crucified in Jerusalem. And then he says, and that's because I've come to give my life as a ransom. So in the context of the gospel, the ransoming, the giving of the life means to be martyred there. But I mean, I don't believe Jesus had superpowers that which he could look ahead and make predictions about the future. Historians aren't allowed, if I'm speaking about historical evidence, we're not allowed to impute supernatural powers to anybody. That's a religious belief which stands or falls on its own merits. But historically, we have to ask, what would a historical person named Jesus, have been able to make of the situation? And simply that, the writer of that verse then knew the ending of the story, and so has Jesus then predicted, which is why it looks to me and others who think this way, who look for the historical Jesus, see this certainly as an embroidered element added to the story.
Well, could I just add something else?
Sure. Yeah.
Could it be possible that if we accept that he said that or something like it,
Yeah.
that the phrase "give my life" didn't have to mean get killed? If I give my life for dance or art or something like that, I'm not going to get killed for it. I'm just concentrating on it.
I mean, if one wants to, one can read it that way. I mean, interpretations are pretty malleable. But I think in the context, when we talk about someone giving his or her life, I think we're talking about like a fireman, a firefighter who dies trying to save somebody, or a soldier, tries to rescue a comrade and gives his life, I'm pretty sure that idiom still kind of rings that bell, although it doesn't have to. So if people want to read it that way, I have no interest in preventing them from doing that. But I think in its context, it certainly intends, I think, that Jesus will die, because it comes right after a prediction of his gruesome death.
Okay. Well, I will shut up after this, but last month, Mr. Reynolds said something about even today, if somebody was just going with the program that Jesus set up to help people and support them and give them safe places to be, that if they were to do that, say in Gaza, they would get in trouble because nobody would like it.
Yep.
Not even the United States wouldn't like it, and the combatants there wouldn't like it. So they could be said to be giving their life for that, even if they went in and did those things and got out.
Yep.
Okay, I will be quiet. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Honor. That's very helpful. And Helen, what's on your mind?
Hello.
Hello, Helen.
I appreciate everything you say. I agree with everything that you say. And I was also thinking of the soldier as an example of someone who makes a sacrifice by putting his life in danger and knowing he's going in danger, but he's doing it for a greater good, so to speak. The only thing that I would challenge, and not challenge, but maybe enrich a little bit, is this whole idea of sacrifice as being a kind of self-immolation, where the self-immolation of the ego is really a fundamental part of the spiritual journey of most people, most religions, I should say. And I see it also in Israel's journey, where they go from making temple sacrifices to making sacrifices of the heart, justice, mercy, go humbly, and the covenant engraved on their heart instead of on the outside. So I see the self-immolation part as a spiritual message, and maybe you would call that interpretation, but I see it in Paul and his focus on love and forgive, and the whole idea of forgiveness is a form of self-immolation. So that the crucifixion, if Jesus had just sort of risen from the dead and been this glorious, triumphant, rejoining with his Father, so to speak, there wouldn't have been that message of sacrifice, of self-immolation, of giving it all the way he did. He gave everything. And so there's that spiritual element that I think I just don't want to see that get lost.
Yeah, there's no danger in it getting lost. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what you point out is exactly correct. I mean, from the prophets down to Jesus himself, I mean, you have the emphasis on these external rituals becoming internalized, right, as works of compassion, mercy, and justice for other people. What I would like to challenge you on, Helen, is this idea that the gruesome death of Jesus was somehow important to his message. When we say, when a firefighter, for instance, gives his life to save someone, they don't intend to die. They intend to rescue somebody and survive, right? And I even want to resist mostly the soldiers, because soldiers go into battle to kill. They don't go into battle to die, even though they assume that risk. And so a firefighter who dies might not actually accomplish saving anybody's life. So that's not the purpose. The purpose is not to die, but it's what we say afterwards, right? That they gave up their life to save somebody else. And I do want to I want us to all think about, because Christians seem to so seldom ponder this. What are we saying about God when we say that it's God's will that Jesus would die? This hideous, horrific injustice. Because what that means is that if anybody along the way had done the right thing, right, if Pilate had said, you can't crucify an innocent man, go home, then somehow God's plan would have been defeated by somebody doing justice. And that's just too weird. That paradox is too conflictive to make any sense out of. So I don't want to say you're wrong. I just want to challenge you on that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just don't know what to do with it not being there. You know what I mean?
Right. I know, because it's been for so long a cornerstone of how Christians think about Jesus, that when you try to think without it, you're at sea for a while. Yeah.
But what would his message have been if he had just been a triumphant Messiah, as the Jews had expected, and had just, brought in the kingdom or just resurrected himself? I mean, what would his message have been? I mean, it would have been a very, very different Christianity that evolved out of that experience.
I think his message would have been the same. I think the Christianity would have been extremely different.
Okay, that's got it.
Very interesting. Thank you for that conversation too. I really appreciate that. And Arnold, what's on your mind?
Yes, my experience in talking to other people is that there is a belief that Jesus' crucifixion was somehow distinctive, as if it was a standalone event. But isn't it true that Jesus' crucifixion was only one of hundreds and hundreds of crucifixions?
I mean, the crucifixion was a Roman public service announcement, is to say that look at this man. This is what happens to people who oppose us in any way, right? In thought, word, or deed. And they crucified people in public places, and those poor victims on the cross could linger there for many hours, even days, and they were deprived of any connection with any mercy at all. And so, yes, it was a very commonly used brutal technique of enforcing an empire on people who didn't want to live that way. And so, yes, in fact, even in the gospel stories, Jesus is one of 3 who are crucified that day. So to think that this is something, like you say, unique, is simply to misunderstand the history.
Well, thank you. And Jacqueline.
So I'm wondering if that accounts for your talking about Jesus and his mission, or his point of view, accounts for why the early Christians didn't focus on the crucifixion. From what I've read a little bit, that there was so much, the focus was not on the crucifixion, but on the message of love, of joy, of peace, of goodness, forgiveness, all that.
Well, there's no such thing as the early Christians. There were different communities of followers of Jesus processing his legacy in very different ways. And as far as we can tell, the ones who actually lived where Jesus had lived there in Galilee, as you said, probably understood him the best. And they're the ones who continued, his program of spreading. I mean, I think Gordon Reynolds explained this just beautifully. This mission of trying to build up a network of care in a world that was uncaring, and that the death of Jesus was seen by those people as a martyrdom. He paid the price for this. And so we honor him by caring about his work. Other Christian communities in other parts of the Roman world lived in different cultural contexts in which, a heroic death, if you read any of the Greek epics, for example, or the Roman stories, it's always, this bloody heroic death is always one which is the mark of a hero, of a divinely appointed almost person. And so they would have been quick to focus on the spectacular death of Jesus as being central to understanding who he is. So it all depends upon, where this message is being processed. And bear in mind, we have written records of only a fraction of that. I mean, we don't have anywhere near a complete catalog of the different ways in which this happened.
Fascinating. Diane, I'm going to move over to Toto since he hasn't spoken yet. So we'll come back to you, but go ahead, Toto.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for tonight. And I've loved your book, the Complete Bible Parallel. That's been super helpful
Thanks.
for me the last year or two.
Yeah.
But my question is, it seems to me that there's very profound principles and teachings that are attributed to Jesus in the Gospels. But it's kind of despite what seems like at times obvious agendas as well. Why would they include such? Why do we say they include the differences that we find in the Gospels seem to point in one direction, where they actually keep some of the teachings of Jesus in that feel like they point in another direction?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time getting a fix on what you're asking. Could you give an example, Toto?
I could, unless I'm asked for one. But I'm thinking like Jesus, say his message or teaching on the rich and the poor, and they seem very directed toward, you got to be loving, you got to be forgiving, you got to give it away.
Yeah.
You have to quit putting all this importance on it. Yet, and maybe it's more, in fact, maybe it seems more in the line that we then, I guess it's often more in the epistles of Paul that we find kind of a different vector going off.
Well, okay, that helps. Paul has a very different issue and agenda than Jesus did. I mean, Paul's trying to keep together communities which are ongoing and intergenerational. Jesus didn't seem to care about that. And I mean, my guess is that the Romans were very good. They cut him down early. I mean, they were very good at their job. They saw this threat and they snuffed him. And so what we see in the Gospels are I think, pretty idealistic things that you'd almost expect a young idealistic person to say. And there seems to be no effort in the Gospels to prepare for a second or third generation of people coming up in this movement, because it simply wasn't the context within which Jesus operated. Now, if he'd lived to be 60 and, had then to think about, hey, what happens, 20, 30 years down the line, we may well have had a very different picture. But I think because he died early. I mean, he died young in life, and he died very early into his public career. I think we only have the starting gun, I think, for a movement here.
Interesting question. Thank you, Toto. And Yvonne, you can just unmute yourself.
Yeah,
there.
thank you. I didn't know I was going to be next. I've always thought that the whole thing about take this cup, this is my blood, eat this is my body, all of that was Jesus reinterpreting things that were familiar to Jews, not saying you got to drop everything to follow me, but take everything that means a lot to you and all these symbols, but let's take them higher, let's reinterpret them, like the washing of the feet during that ceremony, love
Sure.
one another, and take this is my blood, put your life on the line for one another, and eat this body, this is my body, be willing to swallow what's coming down the line for you. And then also the whole thing about being on the cross and being on display and everything. Somebody had another comment that related to this that I really appreciated. It's not just about this guy on a cross, and there's all those teachings and everything that were really the substance of his mission. And so that if you end up like me on a cross with a horrible, horrible death, there's nothing too horrible that means you're forsaken. You, like how Stephen seemed to understand that when he was martyred and he had the smile of an angel. He got that's not just my body. There's a whole lot more going on here, where someone else may have suffered more in that situation, because I think Stephen got Jesus's message about suffering, that you can suffer and not be suffering if you really understand that you are loved, and there's more to you than what's on the cross or what's in your body. And then the resurrection is what was the last proof, the last message. Like, see, you go through all that and it's not the end. That's not the last word. That's not all there is to it. And so that's my take. Thank you for listening.
So do you have a question there, or are you just sharing a comment there?
Sorry, it's just a comment
Yeah.
that I thought might have a little bit of a different angle. I don't know if it did or not.
Do you have a comment you want to make, Bob, or no?
No, I don't.
All right, very good. Thank you so much, Yvonne. That's nice to hear. And Grace, what's on your mind?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm taking off on what Yvonne just said because I loved her larger interpretation. It seems that some organizations, I'll put it, get hung up on the crucifixion, and they don't seem to emphasize the resurrection and the ascension as Jesus's probably most vivid and remarkable demonstration. That life is spiritual in the kingdom of heaven. And, I like focusing on that. Of course, we know we can't get there until, like previous speakers have said, the forgiving and making our life more godlike and all. So I really, really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate what you had to say. I think everyone has just built up like a ladder, a step upon a step. But my point is, how come religions don't really go too much on that ascension and resurrection? And they focus so much, you see churches with Jesus on the cross, I love seeing, with Jesus ascending, I don't mean to be idealistic, but, I think that's really what his whole point was all about.
Okay, thank
That's
you.
it.
Yeah, thank you. And Bob, you want to say any comment about that or no?
Again, there's great diversity in Christian churches today, and indeed some do focus on the death of Jesus at the appropriate time, and then they also have Easter. And some churches, you never know that Jesus ever stubbed his toe. It's all about power and glory and empowerment, and all of these guys who sell, who have their 1-800 numbers flashing at the bottom of the screen as they preach, and it's all about prosperity and all this stuff. And it's such an obvious corruption of the message to leave out the message also of service and service that might entail sacrifice. I mean, my mother did not die a bloody death, but she, in some ways, gave her life to her family. I mean, she raised 6 kids under conditions which would drive even a sane person insane. And, she did so rather successfully and left behind an example of utter selflessness.
Oh, wonderful. So
I would want to hold up that too. And this goes back to, giving one's life. I think, like I said, in the context of the Gospels, it is about being killed, but it certainly, people give their lives in ways in utter selflessness that even if they're not tuned into some intellectual understanding of Jesus' message, they've internalized it for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I don't mean to diminish it,
Right. Sure. Of course.
But it just seems like the ascension is left out so many times.
Yeah.
Well,
Let's, Maureen, what do you have to say?
Well, this, as all these conversations are, has been marvelously mind-opening, and it makes so much sense to me. And I apologize if I've missed how you've said this, Bob, but since what you have said makes so much sense to me as far as Jesus did not initiate atonement for our sins,
right,
then how did it happen? Was it something of the Christian church itself glomming on to some point? And why?
Okay, how many hours do I have here?
I know.
So let me give you a really brief and very truncated and unsatisfactory explanation in the brief time that I have left. It had to do with, they had to do something with the death of Jesus. They had to somehow understand that in a way that did not discredit everything that Jesus stood for, right? When everyone else around them said, see, look, God was not on his side, he would have never let that happen to somebody if they were, right? This guy died without God's mercy. And so they had to defend to themselves and to others, why do you follow a person crucified under Roman law and seen as abandoned by God, right? And so one of the ways in which they did that is, like I said earlier, in following with the way in which they understood the deaths of martyrs, is to see these not as places where God has dropped the ball or forgotten about people, right? But to find some positive significance in that death, in the peculiar form that took in the Christian tradition, was interpreting his death as an animal sacrifice, even though he wasn't an animal, and all these different theories, which are fascinating to explore, but I believe had almost nothing to do with Jesus himself. Right.
That's the thing. If those three methods you outlined earlier,
right,
all seem so anthropomorphic in their sense. So out of how, like, feudal lords and that kind of a thing.
Yes, right.
Why wouldn't people have looked at Jesus's teachings to try to find a reason for his death?
Because he didn't talk about it. He didn't give reasons for his death. I don't believe he did. I think if Shirley wants to invite me back, we can go into this, but hint, hint, wink, wink. Like I said, I think he well knew the danger that he faced. And I think his friends and those who loved him warned him about it.
Yeah.
But he was resolute. He believed that God wanted him to continue his message and his teaching and run that risk.
Yeah, I said it the wrong way. I think not that he had a reason for his death, but why would not people have searched? Religious folks have searched for something that corresponded to what Jesus taught.
Because it's not there, right? I mean, for Jesus, forgiveness was as simple and as difficult as, if you want to be forgiven, forgive, which I think is terribly difficult. I mean, I think most Christians are completely unaware of the bargain they're asking God to make when they recite the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
I mean, they all want unlimited forgiveness, but I mean, do we really are we prepared to give that to those who offend us? And not just say something stupid and slight, but people who deeply wound us. I mean, can we let go of that? And it is in the letting go of that, I think, that we also then allow God to forgive us. So that would be my that's my 3-minute take on that.
Thank you. And Shirley, I think an evening on forgiveness would be fantastic.
I agree with you. I think it's a fascinating idea. Thank you so much. Glad you brought that up. Okay, so Peggy, I know we're kind of running too close, but you may have some things you need to tell us.
Oh, you know I can be brief. I'm not as eloquent, but if you'll look in the chat tonight, there's a lot of kudos saying thank you for tonight. So don't miss it.
Oh, thank you for saying so, Peggy. I appreciate that. Yeah. Wow, Bob, well, you got us going here. And I so appreciate this conversation. It's one that I don't think we've really talked about this before. So it's a new and challenging topic for us, and a healthy one. And I think you've left us thinking we don't have a single answer, but we can all think. So that's a good thing. I appreciate that.
And Shirley, I want to, in front of everyone, thank you for making this possible, because I would not be speaking to these people tonight were it not for you. So you, through your effort and love, have created a community of sacred thought, which I hope just blossoms and spreads. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. It's so great to have you back again. All right, so we're going to close out here, and I'll just remind you that this was the December 2023 Bible and Beyond Textual Studies discussion on the topic, How Jesus, a Jew, Got Tangled Up in the Atonement. Our guest scholar tonight has been Dr. Robert Miller. Once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, we provide a discussion of one or more of the early Christian texts. Some of our knowledgeable scholars lead these discussions, sharing a well-framed overview of these early Christian texts and allowing participants time to ask questions and share their insights. And I hope you know how very grateful we are for your regular donations that enable us to produce these Bible and Beyond discussions. We want to especially thank those of you who have pledged your support on Patreon. If you haven't become a subscriber yet, please do go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to make a monthly pledge. PayPal or checks are also welcome. It's all appreciated. So check the website earlychristiantexts.com for details. And thank you so much.